March 27, 1945, the Shimonoseki Strait. Dawn had not yet broken over the narrow waters that separated Honshu from Kyushu. In the pre-dawn darkness, a convoy of Japanese vessels moved slowly through the strait, cargo ships heavy with munitions, troop transports carrying soldiers south toward Okinawa, escort destroyers scanning the horizon for threats they had learned to expect. Submarines, perhaps, or high-altitude bombers that would appear as silver specks before the bombs began to fall. The sea was calm. The sky was still dark, and then, without warning, the darkness erupted into light. The rockets came first as sound, a shrieking, tearing noise that seemed to split the air itself. Then came the light, streaks of fire arcing down from the sky, dozens of them, scores of them, descending in parallel lines like the fingers of some terrible god reaching down to touch the water. The pilots on the bridges of the Japanese ships had seconds to process what they were seeing before the first rockets struck. They hit the water in geysers of white foam. They hit the decks in explosions of splintered wood and twisted metal. They hit the superstructures and punched through steel plate like it was paper. And they kept coming, wave after wave, launched from aircraft that the Japanese lookouts could barely see in the dim light. American Navy Corsairs and Hellcats, each carrying racks of rockets under their wings, rockets that could be fired in salvos and reloaded in minutes back at the carrier. This was something new. This was something the Japanese had not seen before, not in this concentration, not with this devastating effect. The convoy scattered, but there was nowhere to go. The strait was narrow. The planes were fast. And the rockets, those terrible rockets, followed them down. By the time the sun rose an hour later, the Shimonoseki Strait was littered with wreckage. 3 cargo ships were sinking. A destroyer was on fire, listing heavily to port. A troop transport had been hit so many times that survivors were abandoning ship, jumping into water still churning with explosions. The American planes circled once, checking for targets, then turned and flew back toward their carriers, their ordnance expended, their mission complete. They left behind chaos, confusion, and a new kind of fear. For the Japanese pilots and sailors who survived that morning, the experience marked a turning point in their understanding of the war. They had grown accustomed to American firepower. They had endured bombing raids and naval bombardments. They had learned to expect American superiority in numbers, in resources, in the industrial capacity to replace losses. But this was different. This was not just superior numbers. This was a technological leap, a weapon system that combined the precision of aircraft with the saturation of artillery. The rockets, high-velocity aircraft rockets, or HVARs, as the Americans called them, represented a new dimension of aerial warfare, and the Japanese had no defense against them. The development of the aircraft rocket as an effective weapon had taken years. The concept was not new. Rockets had been used in warfare for centuries, from Chinese fire arrows to the Congreve rockets of the Napoleonic Wars. But making a rocket accurate enough and powerful enough to be worth carrying on an aircraft, that was the challenge. Early American experiments in the late 1930s and early 1940s had been disappointing. The rockets were unstable in flight. They tumbled and veered off course. Their warheads were too small to be effective against anything but the softest targets. By 1943, most American commanders considered aircraft rockets a novelty, useful perhaps for psychological effect, but not a serious weapon. But the engineers kept working. At the California Institute of Technology, at the Naval Ordnance Test Station in China Lake, in workshops and testing ranges across the United States, the problems were solved one by one. The stabilization issue was addressed by designing fins that deployed immediately after launch, giving the rocket gyroscopic stability. The accuracy issue was solved by extensive testing to understand the ballistics, by training pilots in the specific techniques needed to aim unguided rockets. The warhead issue was solved by scaling up. The final version of the HVAR, introduced in late 1944, carried a 45-pound warhead, powerful enough to penetrate the deck of a destroyer or blow apart a locomotive. By early 1945, the HVAR had become standard equipment on American carrier aircraft in the Pacific. Each Corsair or Hellcat could carry 8 rockets, 4 under each wing, in addition to its machine guns or bombs. The rockets could be fired singly or in salvos, and they could be fired from a dive or from a low-level run. The effect was devastating. A single rocket, properly placed, could sink a small cargo ship. A salvo of 8 rockets could cripple a destroyer, and a squadron of aircraft, each carrying 8 rockets, could obliterate an entire convoy in a matter of minutes. The Japanese had nothing comparable. They had experimented with aircraft rockets, yes, but their designs were primitive and unreliable. More importantly, they lacked the industrial capacity to produce them in meaningful numbers. By 1945, Japanese aircraft production was in collapse. Factories were being bombed. Raw materials were scarce. Experienced workers had been drafted into the military. The planes that still flew were increasingly obsolete, flown by pilots with minimal training, armed with weapons that were outdated compared to what the Americans were fielding. The technological gap, always present, had become a chasm. For Japanese pilots who had been flying combat missions since the early days of the war, the veterans of Pearl Harbor, of the Philippines, of the East Indies, the appearance of American rockets in quantity was profoundly demoralizing. These men had entered the war with confidence bordering on arrogance. They had been told and they had believed that Japanese pilots were the best in the world. Their aircraft, the Zero fighter and the Betty bomber, had been superior to anything the Americans flew in 1941. Their tactics had been proven in China. Their spirit, their willingness to die for the emperor, was supposed to be an unbeatable advantage. And for a time, it had worked. In the first 6 months of the war, Japanese aviators had dominated the skies over the Pacific. They had sunk the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. They had driven the American fleet from the Philippines. They had ranged across the Pacific and Indian Oceans with near impunity. But then the tide had turned. At Coral Sea, at Midway, the Americans had started winning. And with each passing month, the material advantage shifted further toward the enemy. By 1945, the veterans who remained, and there were not many, because the attrition rate among Japanese pilots was catastrophic, flew with a sense of fatalism. They knew they were outmatched. They knew that every mission might be their last, but knowing it intellectually and experiencing it viscerally were different things, and the rockets brought that experience into sharp, terrifying focus. Imagine being a Japanese pilot in the spring of 1945, flying escort for a convoy. You have been briefed to expect air attacks. You have perhaps a dozen fighters available, Zeros or Oscars, older models because the newer ones are being reserved for the defense of the home islands. Your aircraft is in poor condition. Maintenance has been minimal, spare parts non-existent. Your fuel is low-grade, mixed with additives because the high-octane fuel is gone. You have perhaps 50 hours of flight time, because that is all the training you received before being sent to a combat unit. The veterans, the ones who might have taught you, are mostly dead. You take off and climb to altitude. You scan the horizon looking for the American planes that you know are coming. And then you see them, a formation of Corsairs, distinctive with their bent wings flying low over the water. You dive to intercept. You are outnumbered, but you do your duty. You line up for a firing pass. And then, before you are in range, before you can bring your machine guns to bear, the Americans launch their rockets. You see the smoke trails, you see the rockets streak toward the ships below, and you understand that you are irrelevant. You are too far away, too slow, too poorly armed to make a difference. The ships are being destroyed, and there is nothing you can do. You can continue your attack, perhaps shoot down one American plane before you yourself are shot down. The Corsair is faster than your Zero, better armed, flown by a pilot with hundreds of hours of training. Or you can break off, return to base, report the disaster, and prepare to do it all again tomorrow. This was the reality for Japanese aviators in the final year of the war. They were not fighting to win. They were fighting to delay the inevitable, to make the Americans pay as high a price as possible, to die with honor. And the rockets, those terrible, shrieking rockets, made even that increasingly difficult. The psychological impact of the HVAR went beyond its immediate tactical effectiveness. The rocket, as a weapon, had a particular quality that made it more terrifying than bombs or machine guns. It was fast, supersonic in fact, traveling faster than the speed of sound, so that it arrived before the sound of its launch. It was visible. The smoke trail marked its path through the air, creating a visual connection between the aircraft and the target that was immediate and undeniable. And it was impersonal. There was no aiming in the traditional sense, no lining up of sights, just a calculation of angle and distance and then the release, and the rocket did the rest. For those on the receiving end, the experience was one of helplessness. You could see the rockets coming. You could see the smoke trails converging on your position, but you could not evade. A ship cannot dodge like an aircraft. It turns slowly, ponderously, and the rockets are fast. By the time you see them, it is too late. All you can do is brace for impact and hope. This sense of helplessness was magnified by the scale of the attacks. The Americans did not use their rockets sparingly. They used them in mass, squadron-level attacks in which dozens of aircraft would strike a single target area simultaneously. A convoy of 10 ships might find itself facing 50 or 60 planes, each carrying 8 rockets, plus bombs, plus machine guns. The volume of fire was overwhelming. Ships that survived the initial rocket salvos would be finished off by follow-up bombing runs or strafing attacks. The entire engagement might last 10 or 15 minutes, and at the end, the convoy would be shattered. Japanese accounts of these attacks, compiled from survivor interviews and captured documents, convey a sense of shock and disbelief. One naval officer, a destroyer captain who survived an attack in the East China Sea in April 1945, described the experience in his debriefing. The rockets came like rain. We could see them in the sky coming down, and we fired our anti-aircraft guns, but it made no difference. They hit the water, they hit the ship, they were everywhere. In less than 5 minutes, we had taken 15 or 20 hits. The forward magazine exploded. The ship began to list. We abandoned ship. I do not know how many men died. Half the crew, at least. We had no chance. This was not an isolated incident. It was the pattern. Across the waters around Japan, in the inland sea, in the straits between the islands, along the convoy routes to Korea and Manchuria, American carrier aircraft hunted Japanese shipping with ruthless efficiency. And the rocket was their primary weapon. By the spring of 1945, more Japanese merchant tonnage was being sunk by aircraft rockets than by any other means, including torpedoes and bombs. The statistics were stark. In March 1945 alone, over 200,000 tons of Japanese shipping were destroyed, much of it by rocket-armed aircraft. By April, the number had climbed to over 300,000 tons. The Japanese Merchant Marine, which had begun the war with over 6 million tons of capacity, was being systematically annihilated. The rockets also had a secondary effect, one that was perhaps even more damaging to Japanese morale. They demonstrated, with undeniable clarity, the depth of American industrial and technological superiority. Each HVAR cost approximately $100 to manufacture. This was not a trivial sum, but it was affordable for the American military, which by 1945 was spending over $8 billion a month on the war effort. The Navy alone ordered hundreds of thousands of rockets. They were produced in factories across the United States, shipped by the tens of thousands to forward bases in the Pacific, and expended in combat at a rate that would have bankrupted any other nation. To the Japanese, this expenditure of resources on a single-use weapon was almost incomprehensible. Japanese military doctrine emphasized conservation, efficiency, the maximum use of limited resources. Aircraft were precious. Ammunition was precious. Every bullet, every bomb had to count. The idea that the Americans could afford to fire rockets by the thousands, rockets that cost $100 each, was a stark illustration of the disparity in wealth and production capacity. And it was not just the rockets, it was everything. The American planes that carried the rockets were themselves products of an industrial system that was operating at a scale the Japanese could not match. In 1945, the United States produced over 40,000 military aircraft. Japan produced fewer than 7,000, and most of those were of inferior quality, built by a workforce that was exhausted, underfed, and working with substandard materials. The American aircraft were maintained by trained mechanics with access to spare parts, tools, and equipment. The Japanese aircraft were maintained by whoever was available, often using improvised parts, often kept flying through sheer ingenuity because there was no replacement available. The pilots who flew the American planes were the products of a training system that, by 1945, was producing aviators with 200 or more hours of flight time before they saw combat. The Japanese, by contrast, were sending pilots into battle with as little as 30 hours of training. The result was predictable. American pilots survived, learned, became veterans. Japanese pilots died, and the few who survived their first missions rarely lived long enough to become skilled. This disparity was visible in the rocket attacks. American pilots executed their missions with precision. They approached at optimal altitude and speed. They fired their rockets at the correct range. They coordinated their attacks so that one squadron would suppress anti-aircraft fire while another delivered the rocket salvos. They followed doctrine because they had been trained in doctrine, because the United States had developed a systematic approach to naval aviation and had the resources to train every pilot to the same standard. Japanese defenders, by contrast, were improvising. They had no effective doctrine for countering massed rocket attacks because they had never anticipated facing such attacks. Their anti-aircraft guns were outdated and insufficient. Their fighter coverage was sporadic and ineffective. They were reacting, always reacting, to tactics and weapons that they had no counter for. There was a sound that recurred in the accounts of Japanese survivors, a sound that became, for many, the defining auditory memory of the final year of the war. The shriek of the incoming rocket. It was not like the whistle of a falling bomb, which rose in pitch as it descended. The rocket sound was constant, a high-pitched scream that lasted only a second or two before impact. But in that second, those who heard it knew what was coming. They knew they were about to be hit, and there was nothing they could do. One Japanese sailor, interviewed after the war, described lying on the deck of a transport ship during an attack, listening to the rockets hit. You could hear them coming, that terrible sound, and then the explosion, and then another sound, another explosion, again and again. I counted 15, then I stopped counting. I closed my eyes and waited to die, but I did not die. When I opened my eyes, the ship was sinking, but I was alive. I do not know why. Many others died. I should have died, but I did not. This randomness, the arbitrary nature of survival, added to the psychological toll. There was no skill involved, no bravery that would save you. You lived or died based on which part of the ship you happened to be standing in when the rockets hit. This was not the honorable death in battle that Japanese military culture valorized. This was slaughter, impersonal and mechanical, carried out by machines and men you never saw, guided by technologies you did not understand. And the rockets kept coming. Every day, every convoy, every attempt to move supplies or troops by sea was met with the same response: American aircraft, American rockets, American destruction. By May 1945, The Japanese had effectively lost control of the waters around their own home islands. Shipping moved only at night, and even then it was not safe. Submarines hunted in the darkness. American planes carried radar and could strike targets they could not see. The sea, which had been Japan's highway to empire, had become a killing ground. The Japanese military leadership understood the implications. Without shipping, without the ability to move resources between the home islands and the remaining territories in Korea and Manchuria, the war was unsustainable. The home islands did not produce enough food to feed the population. They did not produce enough coal or steel to keep the factories running. They depended on imports, and those imports were being cut off. The rockets were not just sinking ships. They were severing the arteries that kept Japan alive. In the final months of the war, the Japanese attempted to adapt. They dispersed their convoys, sailing ships individually rather than in groups. They increased their use of camouflage, painting ships to blend with the water. They moved more cargo by rail and road, where possible to avoid the vulnerable sea routes. But these were stopgap measures, inadequate to the scale of the threat. The Americans had too many planes, too many carriers, too many rockets. For every Japanese innovation, the Americans had a counter. The Japanese also tried to strike back at the American carriers, the source of the rocket attacks. Kamikaze missions were launched, waves of suicide planes aimed at the carriers off Okinawa, off the coast of Japan. Some of them got through, some of them hit, but the carriers kept coming. The Americans had dozens of carriers, fleet carriers and escort carriers, and they could afford losses. When one was damaged, another took its place. The kamikaze pilots died in their hundreds, achieving individual acts of sacrifice that were praised by propaganda, but that did nothing to change the strategic situation. By July 1945, Japan was on the brink of collapse. The cities were being burned by incendiary raids. The navy was destroyed. What was left of it huddled in ports without fuel to sortie. The army was intact, theoretically, but isolated, unable to receive reinforcements or supplies. The government was paralyzed, divided between those who wanted to fight to the last man and those who understood that fighting to the last man meant the extinction of the nation. And still the rockets fell. In the final weeks of the war, American aircraft ranged over Japan almost unchallenged. They struck trains and bridges and factories. They struck what little shipping remained. They struck anything that moved. The rockets were used not just against maritime targets, but against land targets as well: railroad yards, airfields, military installations. The HVAR, which had been developed as an anti-shipping weapon, had proven so versatile and effective that it was being used for nearly every kind of close air support mission. For the Japanese, the rocket had become a symbol of their defeat. It represented not just American material superiority, but American ingenuity, the ability to identify a problem, how to destroy ships quickly and efficiently from the air, and solve it through technology and industrial production. The Japanese had faced many American weapons during the war, but the rocket seemed to encapsulate the entire American approach to warfare. Overwhelming force, technological innovation, mass production, and the willingness to expend resources in quantities that seemed almost wasteful. When the war ended in August 1945, the men who had survived the rocket attacks were among the most relieved. They had lived through something that had seemed, at times, like the end of the world. They had watched their ships burn, their comrades die, their navy disintegrate under a form of attack that they had no effective defense against. And then, suddenly, it was over. In the years that followed, as Japan rebuilt and the former enemies became allies, there was a reluctant respect among Japanese military veterans for the weapon that had devastated their forces. In memoirs and interviews, they acknowledged the effectiveness of the American rockets, the skill of the pilots who used them, the industrial system that produced them. Some expressed bitterness, yes, but more common was a kind of resigned admiration. They had been beaten by a better equipped, better trained, better supplied enemy, and the rockets were the emblem of that superiority. The HVAR itself had a short operational life. After the war, it was gradually phased out in favor of more advanced rocket systems. But its impact on the development of aerial warfare was lasting. It proved that unguided rockets, properly designed and employed in sufficient numbers, could be a decisive weapon. It established the doctrine of rocket-armed aircraft for ground attack and maritime strike missions, a doctrine that would be refined and expanded in the wars that followed, Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. For the Japanese who had faced the rockets in combat, the memory lingered. The sound, the sight, the helplessness. The understanding that they were fighting a war they could not win, against an enemy that could afford to spend $100 per rocket, that could fire thousands of them in a single month, that could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. It was this realization, more than any single battle, that broke the spirit of the Japanese military. They had started the war believing in their superiority. They ended it knowing they had been wrong. On a quiet afternoon in the spring of 1947, a former Japanese destroyer captain stood on a dock in Yokosuka, watching an American aircraft carrier at anchor in the harbor. The war had been over for nearly 2 years. The occupation was well established. The carrier was part of the occupation fleet, a symbol of American power and a reminder of the recent past. The captain had survived the war, one of the few. He had been at Midway, at Leyte Gulf, at Okinawa. He had seen the Imperial Navy at its height and at its destruction, and he had been present at the Shimonoseki Strait on that morning in March 1945 when the rockets had first come in force. He remembered the shrieking sound, the explosions, the chaos. He remembered the helplessness. Now, standing on the dock, he watched as a group of American sailors worked on the flight deck of the carrier, moving aircraft, loading supplies. He could see, even from a distance, the rockets mounted under the wings of some of the planes. The war was over, but the weapons remained, a testament to the technology that had helped win it. He thought about how different things might have been if Japan had possessed such weapons, if Japanese industry had been capable of producing them in quantity. But that was fantasy. The reality was that Japan had never had the resources, the infrastructure, the industrial base to compete with America in the production of advanced weapons. The rockets were not an anomaly. They were the logical outcome of a system that valued innovation, that invested in research and development.